Hi, welcome to another class. Today is the class going to be dedicated to Torah study. Actually, the next couple of classes will be dedicated on revisiting the subject again, and that is Torah study for the Noahide. Now, many times throughout your journey, you're going to get different answers from different places. Today, hopefully, we'll have a definitive answer as to the goals of a Noahide in their study, what they should study, and what could be prohibited in their study. Now, we're going to delve into this, but I first want to make a statement that is a logical and practical statement. First of all, there is no Torah police in the Jewish world, no one there to stop you from studying. No one can prohibit you from studying. Now, there is a warning from the Talmud that talks about the Noahide who studies Torah can be punished by death. And of course, we found out in earlier classes this was not about death by the hand of a Jewish court, but rather the death by the hand of Hashem. The reason why that it's stated emphatically is it is trying to demonstrate the importance of study and the importance of knowing what to study, to treat the law of Hashem with tremendous amount of reverence and appreciation and respect. The bottom line, there's no one out there going to stop you from studying the Torah. However, as conscientious Ben and Bat Noach, B'nai Noach in the world, who follows after the Sheva mitzvot, the seven categories of Torah, and you have studied them, you quickly realize that many of the aspects and understanding of the Sheva mitzvot can only be fully understood in their essence through the other commandments found within the 613 commandments. Now, we all know that not every commandment applies to every Jew. Not every commandment applies to every non-Jew. With that being said, we enter into this idea of Torah study to discover what is our purpose, how do we study, and what are we prohibited to study? What do the sages say? The question is, do Noahides have a mitzvah to study Torah? Well, the answer, very simple, is no, but with a very big asterisk beside it. As with many topics of our understanding, is enhanced by first examining the Jewish mitzvah. As mentioned in an earlier lesson, not all mitzvahs apply to all Jews at all times. I just said that. Nevertheless, every Jew is explicitly commanded to study the entire Torah and all the mitzvahs. However, there is no place where Noahides are commanded to study Torah. To the contrary, we find that the Noahide laws actually restrict non-Jewish study of the Torah. And furthermore, there are prohibitions in Jewish law on what Torah Jews may teach Noahides. Now, when examining the topic of Torah study for the non-Jews, we have to look at three factors. If you'd like to jot these down, go ahead. What the Noahide laws restrict non-Jews from studying. 2, what Jewish law restricts Jews from teaching. And number 3, the positive aspects of non-Jews Jewish Torah study mentioned in the sources. Non-Jewish Torah study, praiseworthy or prohibited? That's the big question next. The main source for the status of a non-Jew Jewish Torah study is a Talmudic passage from Sanhedrin 59a. We'll first examine the complete passage and then break it down line by line as understood by the primary Talmudic commentaries. Now, in your written material in the brackets has been inserted by the editor and the translator of the text, and you'll be able to understand specifically what's happening. First, let's look at this proposition. Rabbi Yochanan said, a non-Jew who delves into Torah is liable to death, as it says. The Torah was commanded through Moses as an inheritance for the children of Yaakov. It is an inheritance for the Jews, not for the non-Jews. Now, the question that needs to be asked after this, why is this prohibition not included explicitly in their Sheva mitzvot, in their 7 laws? Well, number 1 is that the inheritance prohibits non-Jews from delving into Torah because it would constitute stealing. Do you understand the concept? That a non-Jew delving into Torah would mean they are delving into something that doesn't belong to them. That's one thought. The second answer, another explanation, is that the word for the inheritance should be read betrothed. Therefore, a non-Jew who studies Torah is considered to having committed adultery with a betrothed woman. Now, the challenge to this presupposition is this. The other rabbis challenge this teaching from a Beresa. Rabbi Meir would say, from where do we know that even the non-Jews who delve into the Torah study is like a Kohen Gadol, high priest? For it is written that Adam, a man, shall keep them and live through them. The verse does not say Kohanim or Levi or Israel, and what shall do to live through them, but rather a man, Ha'adam, or the man. Let's look at some other answer and resolution. There is a Beresa with Rabbi Meir is referring to a non-Jew who studies his Sheva mitzvot. Rabbi Yochanan is referring to a non-Jew who studies mitzvot and Torah that have no application to him. There are two different things here. Now, Rabbi Yochanan said a non-Jew who delves into the Torah is liable to death, as it says, the Torah was commanded through Moshe, was an inheritance to the children of Yaakov. It is an inheritance for the Jews, not for the non-Jews. As will all Talmudic discourse, this section opens with a preposition supported by proof. Prepositions are either supported by logic or scriptural verse. And in this case, Rabbi Yochanan invokes Deuteronomy 33, verse 4, as his source for the proposition that apparently all non-Jews Jewish Torah study is prohibited. We must ask this question: why is this a prohibition not included explicitly in the 7 laws? The Talmud is surprised that a prohibition serious enough for the live death penalty is not recorded explicitly as a part of the Noahide laws. The Talmud explains, though not specifically listed, it is part of the Noahide laws via derivation. Here's one answer. The explanation is that the inheritance prohibits non-Jews from delving into the Torah because it would constitute stealing. By describing the Torah as an inheritance, the Torah is telling us that it is the right of Israel alone and not other nations. Therefore, one who misappropriates that right is therefore guilty of theft. Another explanation is that the word for inheritance here is betroth. Therefore, a non-Jew who studies Torah is considered as having committed adultery with a betrothal woman. Before here, and in Peshkim 49b, the Talmud points out that the word morasha, inheritance, may be read morasha, betroth. Both answer 1 and 2 are explaining that the prohibition of Jews studying Torah is not recorded as a standalone prohibition because either the answer placed it conceptually under an existing category of prohibition, either theft or sexual immorality. Both of these answers, however, are difficult for reasons that we shall see in just a moment. Despite the prohibitions, Rabbi Yochanan's claim of a blanket prohibition of Torah study for non-Jews is contradicted. It is actually challenged by other propositions. They, the other rabbis, challenged this teaching from Beresa. Rabbi Meir would say, from where do we know that even a non-Jew who delves into Torah study is like a high Kohen Gadol, a high priest? For it is written that Adam, a man shall keep them and shall live through them. The verse does not say a Kohen, Levi, Israel shall do or live through them, but rather a man. The word Adam can refer to mankind, a man, humanity, the first man, depending on the context and usage. Typically, in the Tanakh, Adam implies the nation of Israel. Rabbi Meir argues that in this verse, Adam should be understood in the universal sense of Jew and non-Jew alike. The proof verse here teaches that all mankind can benefit from the Torah. The comparison of a non-Jew who delves into Torah with a high priest is derived from Shem, the son of Noah. Shem was the leading scholar of the Noahide laws in his time and was praised as the priest of God on high, Melchizedek, or Melchizedek. The Talmud challenge is essentially asked, how do we square Rabbi Yochanan's derivation of prohibition of non-Jewish Torah study with Rabbi Meir's apparent endorsement of it? There is a Beresa with Rabbi Meir. He is referring to a non-Jew who studies his 7 mitzvahs. Rabbi Yochanan is referring to a non-Jew who studies mitzvahs and Torahs that have no application. Now, the conclusion of the Talmud, as is often the case, is that Rabbis Yochanan and Meir are not arguing, rather they agree and teaches 2 sides of the same issue. Rabbi Yochanan, non-Jews who study areas of Torah that do not apply to them are liable to death. Rabbi Meir, non-Jews who study parts of the Torah which do not apply to them are comparable to Shem, the priest of God. Non-Jews may only study those portions of the Torah that are essential to their practice and faith as Noahites, as of the Torah that pertains only to Jewish mitzvot are prohibited. With that being said, just about every part of the Torah has some application to the non-Jew in understanding the Sheva mitzvot, the 7 categories. Just remember that. When it comes down to it, there's very little, very small amounts of Torah mitzvot that one would be prohibited to study anyway. Now, this whole question, liable to death, assigning the death penalty for non-Jews is deeply problematic, and we've said this probably 5 times so far in this course. Let's examine the issue again. The Talmud was bothered by the fact that Rabbi Yochanan claimed death as an apparent penalty for non-Jewish Torah study. If this is such a serious prohibition, then why is it not prohibited explicitly as part of the 7 laws? Now, the Talmud answer is puzzling, and it teaches that the prohibition is learned by derivation from theft or from sexual immorality. The answer is fine for explaining how the prohibition fits into the Noahide laws, yet we're still left with an original question. If it is a death penalty issue, then why is it not mentioned explicitly? Now, the assumption of the question is that something as serious as death penalty or death crime is not learned by derivation or implication. This is, in fact, the truism of Torah law. Another problem is the description of a non-Jewish Torah study as theft. A specific requirement of actionable theft under Torah law is the loss of tangible property. Non-Jewish Torah study does not result in the loss of any property from the people of Israel, the Jewish people. Therefore, the case shouldn't even be tried. Similarly, if non-Jewish Torah study is compared to adultery, it certainly cannot be tried as adultery because actual adultery never happened. Clearly, we see that the death penalty can never be administered for a non-Jew learning Torah. What is Rabbi Yochanan's point in telling us this? The Maimonides, C&I, apparently noted the same issue, writing this from Hilchos Malachim 8:10. Moshe gave over the Torah and the mitzvahs only to Israel, an inheritance to the children of Israel. It is also permitted for anyone who wants to convert. Here's another one. Hilchos Malachim 9:10. A non-Jew who learns Torah is obligated to the death penalty. He may learn only the Sheva mitzvot. If he learns Torah, keep Shabbos, or look on new mitzvahs, we beat him and punish him and inform him that he deserves death. However, we do not actually kill him. Now, the Rambam tells us that although the non-Jew is obligated to death, he is not actually put to death. The Meri, Yad David Kesef, Mishnah, and all other commentaries explain that a non-Jew who studies Torah is in fact liable to death penalty. However, their sentence is only carried out by the hands of heaven and not a human court, as we'll discuss this point further in another lesson. There are types of study and types of Torah to be studied. In the above quoted section of the Talmud from the Sanhedrin, it is important to note that the Torah study is never referred to. Instead, the Talmud only discusses the delving into the Torah. What is the difference between Torah study and delving into the Torah? Learning Torah and delving into it. Also, what is called Torah? As for the sake of this prohibition, does it mean the written Torah, or does it mean the oral Torah? Is it about the Kabbalah or the Midrash? These have to be answered. The Mari summarizes the views of the sages as the following. The prohibition is only if he is involved in Torah, not for the sake of keeping the mitzvah, but only because he desires to fathom the wisdom of the written and oral Torahs. Do you get that? But speaking of someone who studies into them not for the desire to keep the mitzvah, but to fathom the wisdom, to garner some benefit that was not derived for them. The Miri is telling us 3 things. The delving means learning deeply to fathom the wisdom of the Torah. And the prohibition of delving applies to both the written and oral Torah. 3, that delving is permitted for the sake of learning the Noahide laws, but not for learning any other areas of the Torah. This implies that Basic non-delving learning, even of areas not related or relevant to Noahides, is permitted. Delving versus learning. Let's look at this. The distinction between delving and learning for the purposes of Torah law is explained by Rabbi Chaim Sofer in his Mishnah Chaim. Rabbi Sofer divides the Torah study into two categories, Mishnah and Gemara. Now, there are actual texts called Mishnah and Gemara, and we have discussed them previously. However, the categories of Mishnah and Gemara discussed here refer to categories of Torah study. For simplicity now, we're going to refer to the text of the Mishnah and Gemara in capital letters in the text and the categories in lower letters. The categories of Mishnah refers to anything composed for the sake of basic knowledge, whether it is the oral or written law. In contrast, Gemara refers to the derivation of laws and exploration of the deeper meanings and structure within the text, either oral or written. All study of Mishnah is permitted for Noahides, while the only Gemara permitted is that which pertains to Noahide observances. Another very important point here is that the method of study and material study are fundamentally the same thing. For example, if one studies the Torah text using the methods of the Talmud or simply studies the text of the Talmud, both constitutes Gemara, delving. This is because they both accomplish the same type of prohibited study. Next question we must ask, what may be studied? It is permitted for Noahides to read the 24 books of the Tanakh, the whole Tanakh. This is clear from many sources, most notably Maimonides, who writes that a non-Jew may even read a Torah scroll. A non-Jew may even learn commentaries on the text, provided that the purpose of commentaries is to explain the main meaning of the text. For example, Rashi, Nachmanides, and these fall under the category of Mishnah. For example, whenever you attend a weekly Parsha study at Nativ or with a local rabbi, often he will use a Chumash, and it has within the Chumash the art scroll commentaries of Rashi, etc. That is very much permitted. However, the study of commentaries which delve into the intent of the text using methods similar to the Talmud are prohibited, and this would constitute the Gemara. Such classic commentaries as the Sifri and Mechilta are therefore prohibited for study. One is also prohibited from learning the Kabbalistic and Midrashic interpretations of the Torah unless they pertain to Noahide. Is any section of the Torah literature composed for the sake of basic knowledge, whether it be oral or written law, is permitted for study because it is Mishnah. Therefore, the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, are all permissible because they teach the laws and conclusions without delving into the reasons and methods of the derivation. However, the commentaries on these works include these printed in the margins of the text of this course and are prohibited to study. Next question. Do Noahides make bracha or blessing on the study of Torah? Well, there's no commandment of Torah study for Noahides intrinsically, and a non-Jew never needs to study the Noahide laws. His only obligation is to obey them. Of course, this is not possible unless he studies them, okay? By fiat of logic and the necessity, Torah study is therefore part of Noahidism. Therefore, mere study of the Torah is not something that a Noahide receives particularly praise for. It is a purely utilitarian activity, yet for going beyond the mere utilitarian need for study and delving into the obligations, a Noahide is praised like a high priest. This delving is a voluntary activity, while basic study is a necessary activity. Neither, however, is a chov in an obligatory commandment, upon which the blessing, who has commanded us, is said. Therefore, Noahide should not make the blessing on Torah study. Nevertheless, a Noahide receives a tremendous amount of reward delving into the Torah, which is of great value in the eyes of heaven. Even though you're not commanded to do or to teach Torah or to study Torah, then you would not be commanded to do a bracha over Torah. Clearly, when one studies the Torah, there's nothing wrong with doing your own personal blessing and gratitude to Hashem for the beautiful words of the Torah, for the river of living water that flows from the Torah. By all means, you should consider taking time to thank Hashem for the study of Torah. Now let's summarize quickly. The basic material, Mishnah, may be studied whether it does or does not apply to Noahidism. Any material which deals with deeper aspects of derivation or analysis of the Torah, Gemara, may only be studied if it is directly relevant to the Torah laws and practices. One who studies that which he is injuncted against is liable to the death of the hands of heaven. Examples of texts permitted for basic study, complete texts that may be studied, would be text of the Torah, text of the prophets, text of the writings, the commentaries of Rashi, Rambam, on and on. The text of the Mishnah, text of any compilations of Torah law such as Mishnah Torah, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, etc. There is text that cannot be studied and text that can be studied. But I'm going to say up front what I said in the beginning. Who's going to stop you? The question is are you going to be a person of integrity to attempt to follow the Torah law as prescribed to the non-Jew? If there are some things that you probably shouldn't study. It's not germane to your life, and therefore you shouldn't study. However, if a rabbi is teaching in a class and he happens to be dealing with something that is about derivations of studied law and analysis of a text, for sure you're not to walk out of the room. Simply know that this is in a category of information that helps you understand the full essence of Hashem, but not necessarily pertaining to you. That concludes this class. We'll go to the next class in just a moment.